wrong?
No, nothing. It's just hot. In the sun. Speaking of which, you guys should probably put on sunscreen.
Okay, can you get my back then?
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is great, and you should definitely play it. That being said, it is very long, and I doubt most players will finish it. I spent over 90 hours playing it to get to the ending, and that's with exploring the world, doing most of the side missions, and most of the content that's available. I didn't 100% it. I think it would take about 150 hours total to get there, but I got my money's worth out of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Let's start with what Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is. It's a sequel to the remake that came out in 2020 for the PlayStation 4. Rebirth is the second game in a planned trilogy that is sort of a remake of the original Final Fantasy VII, but also a sequel reimagining of that game as well. Confused? Join the club. Final Fantasy VII was never really straightforward in its story, and these sequels and remakes just make things worse. If you want to understand what's happening in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we need to talk about all the games that came before it that set the stage of Rebirth's story. And yes, you need to have played those games to understand Rebirth. Don't listen to anyone who says, oh, you just need to have played Remake to play Rebirth. They don't know jack about the series if that's what they're telling you. Going back to the very beginning, we have Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation 1. I don't need to talk about this much, only to say that the Remake and Rebirth are the first 2/3 of the original Final Fantasy VII, fleshing out the story and taking things in an even stranger direction. After Final Fantasy VII, you did have some spin-off games, and then there was the movie Advent Children. You can ignore all of those for now. The only ones that are critical, aside from the original Final Fantasy VII and the remake, is the Crisis Core Reunion game that I reviewed a few months ago. So you need to have played Final Fantasy VII and the Crisis Core Reunion game, along with Final Fantasy Remake, to understand and really get what's going on in Rebirth. Which leads me into the first problem with Rebirth. When you need to have played multiple, extremely long games to understand the story, it severely limits the amount of people who want to play your game. This is reflected in the sales of Rebirth being much lower than Square Enix's expectations. Most people don't beat the games they buy. I don't think this is really an exaggeration or anything insane that I'm saying. I'm one of those rare people that if they start a game, they finish it. Every game I play, I finish it, even if I hated it. If I start a game, I see it to its conclusion. But when I get the achievements for beating a game, it's easy to see that I'm in the minority. 10%, 20%, maybe even 30% if it's a short game. That's the typical percentage of people that see the credits roll. So now do the math. How many people started playing Final Fantasy VII and beat it? Then went on to play Crisis Core Reunion, then the remake, and now we're moving on to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Not a lot. Of course, you'll have people buy it and try it for a few hours, but Rebirth is a commitment. A 90-hour, sometimes pretty poorly paced commitment that you need to almost pledge yourself off other games in order to complete it. How many people can spend 90 hours on a game that's a sequel to another roughly 200 hours of games that need to be played to understand it? Not many.
With all that we saw, what we heard, what we felt, this planet of ours, destiny, our part in it. Best to start at the beginning, perhaps. Midgar, the city of Mako, ruled by the Shinra Electric Power Company, who drained the planet of its very essence, the life stream, and processed it for industry as Mako.
Let's talk about game length. The original Final Fantasy VII took me about 60-ish hours to beat when I played it a few years ago on my PC through the Xbox app. That includes all the side content and defeating the weapons that appeared. If you looked at the thumbnail of this video, which you probably did, you'll see that I spent over 90 hours on Rebirth alone, and I had another 50-ish hours on Remake when it released in 2020. If that trend continues, the next Final Fantasy game will be around the same as Rebirth. So how do you extend a 60-hour original game into 3 much longer sequels? To answer that question, I want to give you another well-known example. In 1937, J.R.R. Tolkien published The Hobbit. This was a simple children's story of a hobbit that goes on an adventure with a wizard and a group of dwarves. Some hijinks ensue, there's a war, and the book ends after only about 310-ish pages. J.R.R. Tolkien goes on to publish 3 more books, the Lord of the Rings series in 1954. They have over 1,000 pages of storytelling, roughly, detailing the rise and fall of Sauron the Dark Lord and the destruction of the One Ring. Alright, so why does this matter? What does any of this have to do with Final Fantasy VII? Well, there's a few parallels here. When Peter Jackson wanted to adapt The Lord of the Rings into a movie, he asked for 2 movies, covering the 3 books in 2 parts. The executives said, well, why don't you just do 3 movies for 3 parts, since it makes more sense to have 3 movies from 3 books, and everyone made a fortune. After he took his massive check to the bank and cashed it, Peter Jackson eventually looked at the Hobbit book and saw dollar signs. Now, before I go any further, I know this isn't actually how it happened, that Peter Jackson didn't really want to make the Hobbit movies, but he was kind of forced into it. But it makes the story more fun, so just go along with it. But the Hobbit book was only 1 book and 300 pages. He needed more content if he was going to take something that was small and stretch it into 3 money-making movies. And that's where the Hobbit trilogy came into being. 3 feature-length movies from a single tiny little children's book. That was accomplished through 2 means: filler and expanding the world. Little bit of one and a dash of the other. Which takes me back to Remake and Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII wasn't a short game. Like I said, it took me 60 hours. But it had a large world, and a lot of its story was condensed into it. There was a lot of things that could be expanded upon. But Rebirth and Remake also chose to indulge in its storytelling, stretching some areas out to near breaking, and adding these strange filler sections that served little to no purpose. Rebirth is affected by more filler than Remake. There are large sections that could have been condensed or just cut altogether. If you mainline the story, you're going to get about 50 or 60 hours. But even then, the pacing can be very odd. There are lulls in the story, entire open world sections that drag on too long. Or there's needless filler parts that could be for character development, but it also could have been an unwillingness on the developer's part to cut anything out. We'll revisit this again in the gameplay section, but there is one detriment or flaw in Rebirth that lowers its score from a 10 to a 9.5, and that's its pacing issues.
Tifa, you can still back out. You don't have to do this.
I'm going, and that's that. There'll be 2 soldiers with me. I'll be fine.
Pumpkin!
Good morning, sir. I'll be your guide for the day.
Tifa? You're our guide?
I sure am. You can ask anyone around here. I'm the best there is.
Before we delve into anything else, let's talk about the graphics and the technicals of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm happy to say that I encountered no bugs or crashes in my 90-hour playthrough. The game is pretty polished on the technical side, although unfortunately I can't say the same for the graphics. I played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on the PlayStation 5, which, at the time of writing this review, is the only platform that it's available on. Load times were fairly reasonable, fast travel didn't take long at all, and you won't be sitting around reading loading screen tidbits in between. Although there are some design decisions in the technical side that I do disagree with. For starters, the menu system continues to be terrible. It's impractical and difficult to understand. For example, if you want to switch out party members, that option is buried in the combat settings rather than the party screen. You can't easily swap loadouts or materia between characters. Upgrading weapons is different from Remake. Instead of leveling up a weapon with new abilities until it's maxed out, Rebirth has an overall weapon level system that opens up new skill pathways and synergy abilities through a portfolio. We'll talk about this again in the gameplay section, but it is poorly explained. Through the first few hours of the game, I thought there was a section I was missing to upgrade my weapons, but no, it's just an overall weapon level. The UI does need a lot more work. Although it is an improvement over Remake, with less switching between characters and slowing down time with selecting abilities, it's still not perfect. On the graphical side, there's two graphical options to choose from. The quality mode that prioritizes graphics at 30 frames per second, and performance mode which aims for 60 frames per second, but at the severe cost of graphics. I want to make this point very clear. You should play Rebirth on quality mode. Performance mode for this game is one of the worst settings I have ever seen for a video game. Rebirth is absolutely gorgeous, from its detailed world environments, its character models, the lighting and the particle effects. Everything is so wonderful that you will often marvel at how beautiful everything is. And you can absolutely enjoy it to its fullest on the quality mode as long as you're fine with 30 frames per second. It doesn't stutter much, but it's not that buttery smooth of 60 FPS. But performance mode is like taking off your glasses and trying to navigate the world in this blurry, smeary mess. Everything suffers to reach 60 FPS in Rebirth on the PlayStation 5. The details are removed, the blur is so intense that it's almost to the point where they smeared Vaseline on the screen. It's absolutely headache-inducing, and I had to turn off the performance mode after only a few minutes because I found myself getting nauseous by it. I did a side-by-side comparison, which I'm showing on screen right now, and you can see the difference for yourself. This is a problem that the Final Fantasy games have been suffering with for a while now. Final Fantasy 15, Final Fantasy 16, the remake, all of them had similar performance settings where quality equals the normal mode and performance means this intense blurry mess. It's clear that Rebirth is trying to push the PlayStation 5 to its absolute limits to reach 60 FPS, and while they do get there, it makes the game unplayable in my opinion. The world Square Enix has made is massive, and it's one of those open worlds that if you see something in the distance, chances are you can walk or ride a chocobo there. It did have a few instances of terrible skyboxes, like these low-quality images in the background of some sections, like the Midgar section, that looked like they took a low-res JPEG of Midgard and just stretched it out. It looked absolutely terrible. There was also some low-resolution textures in the environment as I did the game. Either they failed to load correctly, or I suspect that's just what the developers went with. The character models' expressions are lifelike and they emote really well. Rebirth has this cross between like an anime and a lifelike aesthetic that rides the line perfectly, not moving too much into the uncanny valley territory, but also not quite cartoony. Finally, I don't know if it's the effects of Mako in the water or something else, but every character in Rebirth is incredibly attractive. Not just the main characters, but the side characters and just the people in the backgrounds. Every man you see is jacked and handsome. Every woman is well endowed, beautiful, and loves to show it off. If a character is unattractive in Rebirth, it's a deliberate design decision, and it's worked into the plot. With that comes the fan service, and there is a lot here. There are beach scenes for no reason, tight clothing and bikinis. Everyone wears leather outfits in the desert heat. It can get pretty ridiculous.
Just look at it all. It's so green. A living, breathing planet. Even after everything we've done to it, it's still going strong.
It may look that way, but in reality, it's barely hanging on.
Before we go on to gameplay or story, I want to highlight the sound, the music, and the voice acting in Rebirth. Familiar voice actors from Crisis Core Reunion and Remake return, and they do a phenomenal job with the dialogue they're given. I say that because it can be stilted at times. There's cliche dialogue statements, and there's levels of cringe that you expect if you played Reunion and Remake. I don't know if it's a translation problem coming from Japanese to English, but it just doesn't fit right sometimes. Like maybe it sounded better in Japanese when they wrote that dialogue, but then they just directly translated it so it didn't quite come out the same. It's really a hard thing to quantify. What makes something cool or good versus cringy? When does Sephiroth transition from badass to someone who looks like he's copying bad guys from movies? Oftentimes I found myself looking at these characters and being like, why the hell aren't they just talking to each other right now? Just explain yourself more clearly and this whole misunderstanding could be cleared up. It's sort of a staple in Final Fantasy games at this point. The games are written and animated for the most part in Japanese. So when an English actor speaks that dialogue, the tone sometimes just doesn't match the animation. Tifa is one of the most notable characters for this. Her voice actor has this more mature, deeper voice, and her character is animated in this cutesy way that just doesn't mesh sometimes. Overall, for most of the characters, it's not that bad. But sometimes it's clear that they were going for, this is going to be cool to say, in Japanese maybe, but in English it's just going to sound cringy. The music, incredible. Banger after banger. All the classic Final Fantasy VII songs as they were or remixed and changed so they just hit you all of a sudden. There's these bombastic music sections while fighting, soft and somber tones when the sad moments hit. It's all there. There are only a handful of times that the music just didn't really fit, but they are very few and far between. It's excellent music all around, and hats off to the composer. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the second game in a planned trilogy based off the original Final Fantasy VII. Where Remake covered the Midgard part of the game, Rebirth covers the second third. Everything from leaving Midgard and arriving at Kalm to the events of the Golden Saucer, and then ending at the forgotten capital of the Ancients. This chunk of the original game is the most open world but still linear section. It's right before you gain the ability to fly across the map and have to travel through sections of the world in pursuit of Sephiroth. Just like Remake, this isn't a straight remaster or retelling of the story with updated graphics and combat. This is an entirely different take on the narrative. I want to note that while I won't be doing major spoilers for Rebirth, I will be talking about Remake and Reunion in depth. And there will be minor spoilers for Rebirth's story, but it's mostly just the broad strokes. Alright, so at the end of Remake, Aerith and Cloud had pretty much defied fate, allowing the original story of Final Fantasy VII to be changed. There were confusing sections about Whispers that were trying to maintain the original timeline, and Sephiroth and Aerith seemed knowledgeable of what was going to happen to their counterparts in the PlayStation 1 game. Sephiroth, in particular, seemed to know that he was destined to lose this conflict, and he was trying to change the timeline in any way he could, while Aerith wanted to keep everything the same, but also leave it open for an even better outcome, one where everyone survives and are all happy. Remake could have been terribly confusing, even if you played the original game, as it's almost a sequel/reimagining of the first game, rather than a shot-for-shot remake or remaster. Make things more confusing, at the end of Remake, there's a scene where Zack Fair survives. And going into Rebirth, it's important to know that you need to have played Crisis Core Reunion, since Zack now plays a part in Rebirth. So Rebirth starts in Kalm, a city outside Midgard immediately after the events of Remake. The gang are all together and they're talking about what happened in Nibelheim 5 years ago, where Sephiroth burned down the town and Cloud, Tifa, and Zack confronted him. If you've played Crisis Core Reunion, you'll notice that the story is a little different. In this version, Zack isn't there at all, and instead it's Cloud taking his role. Cloud's memory and mental state is completely messed up, something familiar to anyone who is a fan of the series. Oftentimes, you have no idea if what he's seeing is real, or if it's even him in control of things. It makes Cloud an incredibly unreliable narrator, not just for the Nibelheim story, but throughout Rebirth. From Kalm, the world opens up. You'll travel through different sections of the world map, usually based on a town with the surrounding countryside, in pursuit of these strange, black-robed figures that are being drawn to Sephiroth. Your goal is to stop Sephiroth from destroying the life stream and the planet. He intends to merge all the myriad versions of the planet. Essentially, a new planet would be created every time somebody makes a decision that's different than the original universe. I guess since he knows what's going to happen in the original timeline and that he's going to lose, he's looking to branch out into new versions, where either he won or he can just merge a bunch of them and be in control. So that's the story hook for Rebirth. You travel across the world following these black robes to new locations, where you pick up new characters that are familiar from Final Fantasy VII, the original. Leading this group is Cloud, who wields a giant sword and is a soldier, who's a Mako-enhanced superhuman with a flawed memory and a mind of mush. He keeps getting his past and Zack's past mixed up, since they spent so much time together telling stories and stuff, and Hojo experimented on them both and kind of messed with his head. Joining Cloud is Aerith, the last Cetra, or Ancient, who are a different race of people who once inhabited the planet, but they died after a war with Genova, who's an alien being that arrived on the planet to destroy all life, and humans that had been deceived by Genova to fight the Cetra. Shinra kept her and her mother locked up for years, and even though she acts cheerful, her life has been pretty bad. There's Tifa, Cloud's childhood friend and a martial artist, that isn't sure what's going on with Cloud, only that his memories are messed up. She's from Nibelheim just like Cloud, and Sephiroth killed her father and burned the town, did a real number on her head. They form a sort of love triangle, and spoilers in a typical JRPG, this largely goes unresolved. There's Barrett, who lost an arm when he was living in Coral, when it was attacked by Shinra, and now he has a gun for a hand and a grudge against the company. There's Red 13, also known as Nanaki, who is a talking red wolf from Cosmo Canyon that was experimented on by Hojo and Shinra and joined you as you escaped in Remake, and you couldn't play him in Remake, but you can play him in Rebirth. That's the original lineup, but more people join as you progress. You gain Cat Sith, a mysterious cat-like creature with a Mugo doll, and Yuffie, who's a Wutai ninja who is quite possibly one of my favorite playable characters. She's just really powerful. Then there are a few more people that join you, but you can't play this time around. So you have Vincent, who's a former Turk with a gun, who's also some kind of vampire-like creature that you find in a coffin in Shinra Manor, and you have Sid Highwind, who flies you around the map. Over the course of this 60 to 150 hour game, depending on how much of it you do, the characters become incredibly close, and each develops in a unique way. This is reflected through a relationship meter that as you select the right conversation pieces and do activities with them, your friendship with them deepens. Cloud started as this unfeeling mercenary who thought of everything as a job, but by the end he's actually joking around and cares about his teammates. Barrett is gruff and didn't like Cloud at the start, but now he thinks of him as a close ally and a friend. Each of them evolves and changes in different ways that only a long video game series can demonstrate. The characters, their interactions, their development, that's the best part of Rebirth. And you'll find yourself playing through the game just to see more of their story. It's too bad that Sid and Vincent aren't that developed, but maybe they're just saving that for the next game. They basically just stand there a lot of the time, not doing much. Now, this is where I need to address the elephant in the room. Without spoiling things, after Remake, it seemed pretty clear that they weren't just going to retell the same story with better graphics. The introduction of the Whispers, the changing of fate, Remake set the stage for a big story upheaval. But did Rebirth deliver on those changes? No, it did not. It almost felt like they backpedaled a bit, or maybe just kind of chickened out. There are new things for sure, like having Zack in it and the way Sephiroth is interacting more with the group. But the story beats are still essentially the same as the original game. They travel through the world in the same order, with some minor changes, do basically the same things, and the promised changing of fate doesn't really come into play as much as promised. Maybe they're just setting the stage for the next game where things go nuts, but it certainly didn't feel like it in Rebirth.
Hey, rein it in.
Sorry. No can do.
Kids.
say, I'd like to be briefed on the mission at some point. Because if it's another one of those Turks gigs, you can let me off right here.
Really?
Okay, let's go back to my analogy of the Hobbit book and the 3 movies. It's generally agreed upon that those movies had a lot of stuff that was only hinted or alluded to in the books, but were fleshed out in the movies. Things like the necromancer and the interactions with the elves. But there's also a lot of filler, like the infamous barrel scene. Final Fantasy VII has a combination of both as well. There are large sections of the game that serve to enhance things that were just sort of brushed over or quickly moved through in the original game. A big example of this is Coral and Barrett's interactions with his old friend Dyne. In the original game, it was only a small part where you explored a tiny section of the map. In Rebirth, it's a major story component that could last anywhere from 5 to 10 hours, depending on how much of the side content you do. Is it all strictly necessary? Not really. This is where pacing in Rebirth becomes a problem. There's this urgent need to chase down the Black Road men and find Sephiroth before he destroys the world. They also need to stop Shinra and a bunch of other problems. But then there are these large sections of Rebirth where the story kind of drags and you essentially get filler. Here's the storyline. We need to find Barrett. Alright, race this chocobo first and I'll tell you where he is. Uh-oh, that chocobo is sick. He needs to find greens first before you can race them. Where do you get those greens? Play cards, explore a cave, fight monsters in a tournament, spot a person telling the truth in a game of liars. Get the greens, feed the chocobo the greens, race the chocobo, get access to a new area, find Barrett. In the original Final Fantasy VII, they just dropped you through a trapdoor into the bad part of town and you found the guy you were looking for. Here, it's hours of fetch quests and backtracking for a part of the story that ultimately doesn't really matter that much to the plot. Sure, it's great character development for Barrett, but when it boils down to it, it doesn't really progress the story forward. There are a lot of great additions to Rebirth that enhance the story, but when you compare it to the main plotline of the characters' struggle against Sephiroth and Shinra, it's very clear that it's filler. Here's another example. You're trying to get from the city of Junon to Coral, which is across the sea. So you need to infiltrate the base, disguised as a Shinra trooper, and get on a boat that travels to Coral. But first, you need to participate in a parade. To participate in that parade, you have to collect troops from around the base, teach them the poses you want to do the parade, then you get exposed as a fake, you fight through the base, reach an elevator, then get on the boat. Again, is all that strictly necessary? No, not really. Only a few things are really important. Mainly, Cloud's interaction with Rufus Shinra, meeting Yuffie, and getting on the boat. A big theme in Rebirth is nothing is ever quick and simple. It's always this big adventure. The final thing I'll say about Rebirth's story is that it does suffer from being the middle game in a trilogy. It's very noticeable that they don't want to end things too quickly. Things go unresolved, characters have plot armor to keep them alive for the sequel. There are no real satisfying answers. Middle of a trilogy games and movies generally have the characters returning to a similar situation as they were in the beginning, but in a maybe a little worse state. Empire Strikes Back starts with Luke in the Rebellion, and ends with Luke in the Rebellion minus his hand. Rebirth starts with a group on a journey, and ends with the same group on the same journey, just with a plane. I think if you make a list of truly important things that happen in the story in Rebirth, it would be pretty short, especially for a game that took me 90 hours to beat. There are perhaps a half dozen story beats that are critical for the narrative, but most of the other stuff is just additional flavor.
Seen those near the village, and they're not nice. What do you think?
I think I got this.
Then they're all yours.
Copy that.
Let's talk about the gameplay. I'm going to divide this into easy to digest chunks, starting with combat. Combat is very similar to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but improved in a few key areas, and also very different in a few others. It's still a third-person action RPG. It's still not turn-based. You're going to be controlling one character out of a group of 3 with the ability to cycle through them. You can spam basic attacks all you want. You can dodge to avoid damage and block to reduce it. Attacking and defending generates ATB action charges. Attacking and defending generates ATB charge, and this is the most important part of combat. Everything you do outside of the basic attacks, dodges, and blocking require ATB. Sometimes it's just a single bar, sometimes 2, depending on what you want to do with it. If you want to use an item, that's 1 bar. Use an ability, 1 bar. Spell, 1 bar. ATB is fundamental to combat, and characters that generate ATB faster than others are obviously superior. Yuffie is hands down, in my opinion, the best, followed by Barret, Red 13, Tifa, and Cloud. This can be a bit subjective on the ordering, since I didn't do a lot of tests, but this is just how I feel about it as I played through the game. Yuffie generates ATB like crazy, meaning she can spam out spells and abilities like no one else. Give her a prey materia, she can keep you healthy throughout battle. Notice an elemental weakness when you assess them. She can throw out her weapon and use environmentally charged attacks to exploit it, generating massive amounts of ATB. This is not really an exaggeration. Yuffie can win the entire battle all by herself. If Yuffie is one of the best, Aerith is by far the worst character to play as in combat. She is absolutely terrible. She generates pitiful amounts of ATB because she attacks really slowly. Yuffie can often do 3 or 4 times as many actions as Aerith in the same span of time. This reliance on ATB makes picking your squad incredibly important. You generally want to get a mix of magic, melee, and long range in your group, since you want to balance exploiting weaknesses, staying healed, and being able to hit flying enemies. Unlike the old turn-based game, flying enemies are a hassle in both Remake and Rebirth. If there are flying enemies in a battle, you need Aerith, Barret, or Yuffie, because everyone else will not be able to hit them, meaning no ATB for abilities. So what can you use ATB for? Well, spells for one. Materia are back from Remake and the original, but don't expect your old materia if you just beat Remake. You start with all new ones at level 1 again. ATB prevents spamming spells, but so does your limited magic points. In the original, you could have up to 999 MP and use magic every turn. In Rebirth, you're capped at 99 MP, and spells are both expensive, delayed, and they cost ATB. The stronger the version of the spell, the longer it takes to cast. Take Fire, for example. The base cost is 4 mana points. It takes a second to cast and a single bar of ATB. Fyra, the second stage, takes 10 mana, and third is 21. That means you can only cast the strongest one a couple of times before you're out of mana, because you're not going to be close to 99 for most characters. Plus, each time you cast a spell like Fire or Fyra, takes an ATB charge, meaning you're giving up a chance to heal or do an ability just to cast that spell. Viagra, the strongest version, takes 2 ATB bars, something that is very rarely worth it. Worse, you can be interrupted in the middle of casting a spell or using an ability, something that does happen quite frequently. If you're playing as a character, enemies tend to focus on the one you're controlling. But you can really only generate a lot of ATB while you're in control of that character, meaning you're often going to be attacked. So it's almost better to just generate ATB as a character, switch to another character, then use the left or right triggers to give a command to an ally to cast a spell. Thankfully, the amount of character switching has been significantly reduced for Remake. That was a major complaint from the first game. You could get whiplash from how often you were switching characters. Here, you can pretty much play as a single character most of the time, and you're going to be fine. Sure, you can switch, but you don't have to play hopscotch like in Remake. Abilities have been significantly expanded from Remake, with elemental abilities that help you exploit weaknesses if you just don't have the right materia for that specific element. They don't do much damage, but they are useful and quick. The stagger mechanic comes back, and a major part of this game is exploiting a weakness or fighting in a certain way to pressure an enemy and eventually stagger them for major damage. Enemies come in a lot of variety and are generally pretty fun to fight, although a few of them are bullshit. You will have flying enemies that interrupt every action you take, so don't expect any healing when you're fighting those. There are enemies that are going to petrify your entire team or turn you all into frogs. Of course, you can equip materia, use items to cure it, or equip accessories to prevent them in the first place. But that often requires planning before you enter a fight, something that's not always possible. This is the part of the review that I want to switch into the difficulty of the game, and some of the more unfair aspects of Rebirth. Open world games are balanced in two different ways. They either scale, making exploration really pointless, so that there's going to be a consistent level of difficulty throughout the story, or they make the game difficult for people who did no exploration, and really easy for people who did everything. Rebirth did the latter, with the main story being much easier if you grinded side content and explored the maps throughout, until the developers introduced some elements of bullshit. Most combat encounters have you playing in a certain way. That means spamming attacks, blocking and dodging, then using your abilities to exploit weaknesses. You can kill most enemies and bosses pretty easily this way, provided you're at the right level and you have pretty good equipment. But the game occasionally throws bosses at you that are not level or skill based, but the sort of play the game we want you to play. Two of these bosses, without giving big spoilers, are Rufus Shinra and Sephiroth himself. Rufus Shinra will counter the majority of your melee attacks. You're forced to play as Cloud for this encounter, a melee character, and in order to hit Rufus, you need to generate ATB to use an ability at a certain time to stagger him. The game doesn't tell you which ability, that's up to you to figure out for trial and error. So you try attacking and whoops, counter, no ATB for you. Then you die, and you can't skip the cutscene before the battle, because it's not really a cutscene, but an in-battle cinematic. So you need to sit through this minute-long intro thing, and then try again, and again, until you just sort of stumble onto winning through spamming summons and blocking everything. Sephiroth is pretty similar, but in his case, it's unblockable and unsurvivable super moves that are a DPS check. If you do enough damage in a short amount of time, you win. If you don't, you lose. The game doesn't tell you that, but you need to figure it out after dying a bunch of times. And again, this is one of those encounters where there's no skipping the long cutscene, even though we know people are going to keep dying. And I did all of the side content, found every point of interest, and I was really high level. I had the best equipment, I maxed all my materia, and I still got my ass kicked over and over again on these enemies. This is a form of artificial difficulty that was introduced to prevent you from power leveling your way through the difficulty. In the original Final Fantasy VII, you could get incredibly powerful really easy if you just grinded for a little while, meaning you could trivialize a lot of bosses just by being overleveled. Rebirth tries to fix this problem, but it does just make it frustrating. Aside from the combat, we have the open world. This has been likened to a Ubisoft game. The game plays like this. You have a town. You leave that town, there's an open world with a destination marker far in the distance. You can then explore the open world, fighting monsters and unlocking towers and doing side missions and other stuff. Then, when you're ready, you can go to the marker and start a linear type mission that takes you to the next town or the open world map. It's up to the player to decide if they want to explore everything or just travel to the next destination. You don't strictly have to explore everything, but you will be missing out on a lot of content, and you're going to have a pretty hard time with the main story if you don't. The majority of the side content is really good. At least the side missions are. A lot of the markers in the open world are just like, fight this creature, unlock this tower, scan this thing. Your enjoyment of it will depend on what you like to do in these games. I do enjoy times when I just turn on a podcast, explore the world, find all the world intel, and complete everything in each section of map, and I'm not upset that I did it. But there are other people who just want to strictly fight or do the story.
Reinforcements are here! We're saved!
What in the hell is going on here?
And why do we look like this?
Hey, watch where you shoot!
Captain! Don't give up the fight!
No!
Minigames. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has a ton of them, sometimes too many, and some of them are fantastic, while others are frustrating as hell for a completionist. Let's start with the biggest minigame, Queen's Blood. It's like Gwent, except players are on the same board fighting for position. The game is pretty simple. You build a deck either from a standard pre-made selection of cards, or with cards of your choosing. You place cards on one of 3 rows, and you're trying to get more points on a row than your opponent. Whoever gets more points on that row wins the row, and then their points are added to the total. Whoever has more points at the end wins. You start each game with a handful of cards, and then you draw a new one every turn. Your deck has 15 cards total, and you generally design your deck around a certain mechanic. Maybe you want to expand quickly, since you can only place cards on spaces with a pawn or a little green marker on them. That represents your ownership, and red if it's your opponent's. Have a green marker on all the spaces means that your opponent just can't play any cards and you're free to sweep the board. Or maybe you want to destroy your opponent's cards or buff your own. There are a bunch of different ways to play Queen's Blood and a bunch of different archetypes. Queen's Blood is built into the main story and you're going to have plenty of opportunities to play. Are the side missions of Queen's Blood entertaining and worth it? Although I personally didn't enjoy the end of the storyline, the game itself was super fun. Although, like Gwent and Witcher 3, there are decks that just crush everything in their path. Other minigames include Chocobo Racing, which is like Super Mario Kart, where your Chocobo you pick has different abilities, and the gear you can buy in the world affects their stats. There's a few fighting minigames, some strategy minigames that you play in search of proto-relics, some that use this old style of animation from the original game to a hilarious effect. Some minigames are impossible and frustrating as hell, like Cactuar Crush, where you fight as Aerith in this timed event that I think it must be impossible to get the high score in. Or flying a chocobo through these rings that are just terrible. I can't do it. Then there are others that can be cheese, like this robot minigame that you can span out robots in a way the developer must have overlooked. Most of the minigames come right before and after the Gold Saucer, and it's really easy to get tired of them because of how they're paced. When you arrive in Coral and Costa del Sol, the Golden Saucer areas, they're back to back, and they both have you playing minigames as part of the main story. I think this is the section where a lot of people are going to quit out of this game. Finally, there's RPG elements, and I kind of already talked about this in the technical section. The menus are bad, the weapon upgrade system is confusing, the folio upgrades that give you a new abilities is alright, but again, poorly explained. The materia menu is definitely better than Remake, but the entire UI does need an overhaul for the next game.
Though, I'm sorry to say, we aren't open quite yet, and I'm not even sure when we will be. Those Mooglets are refusing to come back, and we can't do business without them, Kupo.
And that's it. That brings us to the end of another review. Is Final Fantasy Rebirth good? Yes, it's excellent, and I rated it at 9.5 out of 10 for the strength of its gameplay and story alone. Is it perfect? No, and we talked about a lot of that. There's still a lot of room for improvement for the next game, particularly in its pacing and its menus. I would recommend that if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, pick this one up either on sale or at full price, and get the remake as well, and give them both a try. There isn't really a time frame for when this game is going to arrive on PC, but it's easily worth the full asking price now. I'm the Casual Console Gamer, thanks for watching, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next review.
I'm with you.
I appreciate it. Shall we? No need to worry about the future till it comes. Not until the moment arrives. And when it does, I'll be counting on you.
Good.
Not you. That was to her, my future self. Can't say when you'll meet, but trust me, you'll love her. Just you wait.